Live NFL trivia every Wednesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge for a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. Bud Grant is one of the greatest head coaches in the history of the National Football League. There's a reason he's a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame, forever enshrined in canon. Despite coaching the Vikings for 18 seasons, he never had a season with double-digit losses. He made it to 4 Super Bowls. From 1968 to 78, in that 11-year period, his Vikings won the division 10 times. By the time his coaching career ended in 1985, he was one of the winningest coaches in the history of the sport. And between his 2 decades in the NFL and his decade in the CFL, he truly is one of the most successful coaches to ever step foot on the gridiron. And something unique about Grant is that he never believed in suspending players. Whatever the incident was, and whatever the player did, he never issued suspensions. But after 27 years, that changed. You really had to mess up to get Grant to issue his first suspension in his 27 years of coaching. But that's exactly what Vikings running back Ted Brown did in 1983. And the way everything played out? Well, it was kinda strange considering the circumstances. This is the story behind the bizarre suspension of Ted Brown, the player that made an infamous bit of Vikings history. Before I talk about the actual incident in question, we need some context as to just who Ted Brown is, and the events that led up to Bud Grant being at his wits' ends with him. In 1978, even though the Vikings won the NFC Central, albeit with a fairly mediocre 8-7-1 record, they did it with an absolutely anemic running game. Their running game finished dead last in rushing yards and yards per attempt, averaging an abysmal 3 yards per carry and less than 100 yards per game. Whether it was Chuck Foreman, Ricky Young, or Robert Miller getting the ball, nothing was working. With that, the Vikings decided that they needed to address the position early in the NFL draft, and they took NC State running back Ted Brown with their first pick in 1979. He was going to be the man to revive a dormant Vikings rushing attack. The end result? Well, after not doing much in his first season, as he only scored 1 touchdown, he became a very solid player once the 1980s rolled around. He had over 1,500 yards from scrimmage in 1980, which ranked 7th in the league, and he followed that up with over 1,700 yards from scrimmage in 1981, also ranking 7th in the league that year. Especially in 1981, the offense revolved around getting the ball into the hands of Ted Brown. He had 274 rushing attempts and 83 receptions, meaning that he touched the ball 357 times. For some perspective, he had 46% of all touches that season, and the next closest player was Ricky Young, who had 90. Brown was getting an insane workload, and that was part of the reason that the Vikings drafted Darren Nelson with their first-round pick in 1982. You can learn more about that draft selection by clicking the card in the upper right corner. Brown was a very solid player from Minnesota, and he had a lot of iconic moments over his first 4 seasons with the team. There was his game-winning fourth-quarter touchdown against the Chicago Bears in Week 6 of the 1980 season, which gave the Vikings a 13-7 victory. There was his receiving touchdown against the Cleveland Browns that same season in Week 15, where his score brought the Minnesota deficit from 23-9 to 23-15, in a game that culminated in the famous Miracle at the Met. And then there was his incredible game in the first round of the 1982 playoffs against the Atlanta Falcons, when he took over the game on the final drive and scored the game-winning 5-yard rushing touchdown with 2 minutes left to give the Vikings a dramatic 30-24 victory. It was a nice start to Brown's career, as over his first 4 seasons, he established himself as a big part in Bud Grant's offense. But in 1983, things would start to go south. Early on, there were no signs of danger with regards to Brown's role in the offense. He was playing like he normally did, and in fact, was on pace to have one of his best seasons ever. Through the first 9 weeks of the season, he had 463 rushing yards and over 4 yards per carry, and had 40 receptions for 336 yards. This meant that he was on pace for 823 rushing yards, 71 receptions, 597 receiving yards, and over 1,400 yards from scrimmage, and he was finding the end zone at will. His career high for touchdowns in a single season was 8, set back in 1980. Through the first 9 games of 1983, he already had 8. Granted, a lot of these were just him punching it from the goal line, as 4 of them came from 1 yard out, but you couldn't deny Brown's role in the offense, and couldn't deny the fact that he was showing no signs of slowing down. However, in Week 10 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, Brown only got 3 carries for 2 yards, which was a far cry from his output in previous weeks, including just 2 weeks ago against the Green Bay Packers when he had nearly 200 yards from scrimmage and touched the ball 31 times. The reason? He suffered a separated shoulder. Minnesota lost the game 17-12 in the absence of Brown, and now they had to deal with him being out for an extended period of time. At this point, if the Vikings, who were sitting at 6-4 through 10 weeks, were going to make a push, it was going to be without Brown, at least for a few games. In the 3 games that Brown was out, the Vikings went 1-2, and they were about to take on the Detroit Lions in an absolutely critical matchup in front of the entire country on Monday Night Football. I cannot stress how important this game on paper was. Both the Lions and Vikings were sitting at 7-6, tied for the division lead. With just 3 games to go, whoever was able to win this one would be sitting pretty, especially if it's the Vikings, since they beat Detroit in their first matchup 20-17 on a fourth quarter field goal by Benny Ricardo. And the good news for the Vikings was that Brown was healthy. After missing 3 weeks with a separated shoulder, he was ready to play in this all-important Monday night game. The only problem? Even though he was healthy, he wasn't going to be playing in this one. Because in the week leading up to the game, let's just say there was a ton of drama between he and head coach Bud Grant. One of the things that I mentioned earlier was that Bud Grant had never suspended a player in his entire career. While players on his team have obviously gotten suspended by the league, he himself has never issued a suspension. And this isn't a coach that was just starting out and didn't have the sample size or the opportunities to do this. He was the head coach of the Winnipeg Blue Bombers from 1957 to 66, and had been the head coach of the Vikings since 1967. For some perspective, when he was starting out as a professional head coach, Sputnik had not yet launched, perhaps Elvis's most famous song, Jailhouse Rock, had not yet been released, and in baseball, the Dodgers and Giants were still playing in New York. And yet, despite that lengthy career, there were no suspensions. So that raises the question, what the heck did Ted Brown do to get on Grant's bad side and make him issue his first suspension ever? Well, Brown was supposed to show up for medical treatment for that separated shoulder. He didn't show up. And this wasn't a one-day absence. He skipped not 1, not 2, but 3 days of medical treatment. He also missed team meetings and missed practice. In the days leading up to the game, he was away from the Vikings facility and was nowhere to be found. In the eyes of Grant, this was a guy who was not serious about coming back, and who was not a part of the team. And with that, Grant, for the first time ever, suspended one of his own. As Grant said, he needs to convince me of 2 things. He needs to convince me that he had a reasonable excuse, and that he desperately wanted to play. Naturally, when Brown found out about the news, he was furious. He said that he missed practices and whatnot on mounting personal problems in his family that he needed to tend to. But Grant didn't buy this excuse. And to make matters even crazier, this wasn't a 1-game suspension. This was a suspension for the rest of the season. Brown was gone, and Brown thought that the punishment did not fit the crime whatsoever. Brown said, "I know what I did was wrong, but I think that 3 games is an awful lot to pay." And he had no idea what Grant wanted him to do in the first place to lift the suspension. Asking to the media, does it depend upon my therapy? Does it depend upon me getting my problems worked out? I don't think I can do that in a week. Being suspended just gives me another problem, and something else to think about. Whatever the case, Ted Brown was suspended for the rest of the year. But to make the drama a bit more bizarre, this suspension would be lifted almost immediately. On December 5th, 1983, the Vikings traveled to the Pontiac Silverdome to take on the Lions minus one of the best weapons on their team, Ted Brown. It did not go well, as the Lions won the game 13-2, with Minnesota averaging just over 3 yards per carry, and with the Vikings not having a single run go for double-digit yardage. But after the game, Bud Grant decided that Brown no longer deserved to be suspended. After suspending him for the rest of the season, he lifted the suspension roughly 4 days later. Why Grant lifted the suspension is unclear. He never said why he did this. All Grant said was that no conditions had to be met, no penance, with regards to ending the suspension. And now I'm starting to understand why Grant never really gave out suspensions, because I'm not sure he knew how to. When you suspend a player, it's about sending a message. You try and get the message across that what the player did was unacceptable, and you want to ensure that he never does this again. By suspending a player for missing practice, you hope to get the message across that missing practice is unacceptable, and that anyone who does this will be punished. But for Grant to say that Brown was suspended for the rest of the season, and then lift the suspension, you would assume that Brown did something, and that Brown did one of the 2 things that Grant asked of him. However, Grant said that no conditions had to be met, which raises the question of why he even suspended him in the first place. What was the message he was trying to get across? Was it just to scare him? Everything about this was kind of weird. However, even though the execution was a bit weird, Brown said that he had no hard feelings against Grant and the Vikings. He said that he was glad that the suspension was over, and said now I can get back to playing ball. That's what I like to do best. Plus, losing the money hurt. It was reported that Brown lost 1 game check, which was around $10,000. On top of that, Brown said that he hoped that the organization didn't hold the incident against him, as he had no ill will toward the Vikings, and he wanted to finish his career in Minnesota. So that raises one final question. How did this bizarre saga officially come to an end? Brown played the following week after the suspension against the Chicago Bears, and even though the Vikings lost the game 19-13, all but ending their chances at making it to the postseason in the fairly mediocre NFC Central, Brown scored a third-quarter touchdown. While he didn't get the bulk of the reps, as those went to Tony Galbraith and Darren Nelson, Brown was actually playing, even if it wasn't in the same volume that he was prior to the injury and the suspension. And even despite missing a good chunk of the year, Brown still finished the season with 10 rushing touchdowns, which was the most he'd ever scored in a season. Grant retired after the 1983 season, and Les Steckel was named the new head coach. Brown would lose some of his role to Darren Nelson, but would still get his fair share of touches, as through the first 13 games of the 1984 campaign, he had nearly 800 yards from scrimmage, and was on pace for another season with over 1,000 yards in that category. However, he was involved in another controversy with the coaching staff when, after suffering an injury, he watched his team play Washington while sitting in the press box. At halftime of the game, he, alongside Sammy White, decided that it would be a good idea to leave the game and go to a restaurant. Obviously, Steckel was not pleased about this, as he called Brown a quitter and said that he didn't want him around here anymore. However, Brown wasn't even suspended for this. In other words, the controversy did not end after Grant left the team. Brown would eventually end his career in 1986 as a member of the Vikings, as he finished his career with just under 7,400 yards from scrimmage in 8 seasons. While he was never a Pro Bowler, and while he probably was never in that top tier of running backs, he was still a very solid player who had a lengthy and productive career, and was an instrumental part in Minnesota's offense during the turn of the decade in the 1980s. However, many Vikings fans' lasting legacy of Brown isn't the great games he had or the amazing runs that he showcased, but rather, their lasting legacy of the former first-round pick is that he was the man who pushed Bud Grant to his breaking point and caused the Hall of Fame coach to issue his first suspension ever. Get your official Jaguar Gator 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Wednesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes, link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at Jaguar Gator 9 and subscribe to 60-Second NFL History on YouTube. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. See how you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.